Thank you. Whilst people are coming in, I'm going to introduce Paul Sunderland. My name is Christoph Sauerwein. I am one of the founder, director of iCAAD, and incidentally CEO. And yeah, Paul, I feel really, really held and supported by those sources, so thank you, by the way. We thought about different themes, Paul, and all of a sudden the idea of talking about adoption came up in our conversation. And that's the first time we addressed the theme at iCAAD over the last 4 years. And I don't know why, because I reckon it is one of the major wounds. Even if it's life-saving, a human being can experience this as life. So Paul Sunderland today to tell us all about adoption. Paul has 35 years now of experience in the industry of getting people to heal their wound. I don't know why I say industry. And he's been also a great advocate of that, with many, many TED Talks conveying a language of wisdom and compassion about attachment, detachment, the pain of being human amongst other human, the pain of addiction. A lot of fantastic messages I always cherish. And on top of that, you're seeing many, many clients. So you're also practitioners, which is so important because we can drown ourselves into theory, right? And you've got a few co-therapists here. So the title Paul decided to give to this presentation is Relinquishment and Adoption, Understanding the Impact of an Early Psychological Wound. I'm not going to unveil that at all. I just want to say something here. We're talking about attachment today. We're talking about adoption, but why don't we gather a little bit to make that more attached? So if up to you, but if you want us to join the front rows, I think that'd be fantastic, because there's something I have to say. Your voice is central into what you have to say. Your energy is so important that the closest you are to Paul, the most you will benefit from his words. Am I overselling it now? Right. Okay, well, thank you so much. Warm welcome, Paul.
Thank you very much indeed. We need to stop that. Those were my colleagues. And actually, I was rather enjoying this. I was feeling a bit sort of anxious in the last sort of half hour. There was quite a bit of sort of limbic resonance. I was sitting at the back and just sort of looking at these guys that I know quite well and I work with quite a bit, and sort of soothing. And I'm a real believer in equine-assisted psychotherapy. Horses are experts in reading somatic signals. They pick up on respiration, heartbeat, muscle tension, and they teach boundaries, self-soothing, affect regulation, and all of that. So I thank them, and thank you for coming to this talk. I know some of you, which is quite nice. A bit of limbic resonance again, very important for me to sort of just calm myself being here. Also, I've spoken at iCAAD and quite a few times, and it feels a bit like a Glastonbury experience, because I'm usually downstairs in one of the small stages, and it's like I feel like I've made it to the pyramid. And then I realized it's the beginning of the day. This is not a headline act, but we're getting there. We're getting there. There you have it. So I've been working around addiction for actually 35 years, which is a bit shocking, but true. I worked in primary treatment, both in this country, but also the other side of the Atlantic for 15 years, and I've worked in private practice doing addiction psychotherapy and consultancy for the last sort of 20 years. And I'm a bit of an anorak. And I still really sort of enjoy, and I'm really stimulated by it all, because I think it's a really exciting time, actually, for the addictions field. When I started training in the 1980s, counsellors wore sort of tweed jackets. We looked a bit like sort of private school sort of teachers or something. And we treated alcohol and drug addictions. And now, of course, we've got all the process addictions. We start thinking about trauma. And we've also got, what really fascinates me is these sort of longitudinal studies of people in recovery and starting to think about sort of who does well, who doesn't do so well, and why. I have quite a bit, this is a topic that's actually quite close to my heart. I did the first talk on this actually at a precursor of iCAAD in 2008. I looked when I saw my notes. And I think it was the first time that there had been a talk on addiction and adoption and putting those sort of two things together. And I do a talk like this. I mean, perhaps not even once a year. But it just really fascinates me. I have a lot to say on the topic, so actually I probably will really fill the hour, and there'll be lots of things that won't be said. So it may mean there's no room for questions. From my point of view, there's probably no room for complaints either. But I will be lurking around. I will be lurking around if you want to sort of tackle me on something. But adoptees are overrepresented in addiction treatment programs and in recovery programs. We didn't know that at first. When I trained in the 80s, I trained, it was the second treatment centre that had opened up in the UK, Cloud's House, it's still going. And the unit manager that I did a placement on had been adopted. I don't know quite how I picked that up. There were 4 trainees, including myself, and one of them was adopted. Interesting. The next year, there was another group of trainees, one of them was adopted. And actually, as some of you know, a lot of people who work in the addictions field are sort of in recovery. They sort of have some issues. In fact, because if you had more sense, you'd open a flower shop or something. And so actually, what starts to happen, this is quite interesting. But I think I just sort of clocked it. What I do wonder, though, is when we did case conferences and things all those years ago, I wonder how many people we missed that were adopted, that may not have said, because I certainly know from private practice that somebody comes in, usually in private addiction psychotherapy in private practice, people come in with process addictions, and you sort of ask them, the first question is sort of, why are we here, and why now, and you might get them to tell you a little bit about their story. What was starting to happen, certainly sort of 10 or 15 years ago, is at the end of somebody telling you their childhood story, they might then say, by the way, I was adopted. So I do wonder, how much we missed. I'm also very interested in, I'm interested in what happens to people during the course of a recovery, and I become quite interested in what we're calling the disguised traumas, of which there are 2 that fascinate me. One is early boarders. People who went to boarding school at age 7 or 8 are overrepresented in treatment programs and recovery programs. Now, there might be a good reason for that, because actually they may well come from a background where they could actually afford to pay. Families might be able to pay. And we certainly need to do some more research. But I think it's quite interesting, because, of course, the early boarding wound is disguised as privilege. But actually, in calling it privilege, it covers up both a relinquishment, if you like, an abandonment, a captivity, because schools actually decide when you're there, when you go, and, of course, the enormous potential for abuse, although you don't have to go to boarding school to get abused, but you certainly are in captivity while it's happening. So I'm quite interested in all of that, the disguised traumas. And, of course, if you think about early boarders, actually, if a child is put into care, it's a tragedy. If you're sent to boarding school, it's a privilege. I think that's quite interesting. And then, of course, adoptees. And I think adoption and adoptees are also, this is a disguised trauma, because what I'm going to suggest to you is that the trauma isn't being adopted. The trauma is relinquishment. And that's the point that I want to make. But the cover-up, if you like, is that these children are chosen and perhaps saved. So a bit like the early boarders who are privileged. There isn't a PowerPoint. I do hold my notes in my hand because I'm going to talk about the brain a bit later on, but there's a part in my left frontal lobe, in my cortex, is a part of the brain named after the guy that found it, called Broca's area. And under extreme stress, Broca's area starts lighting up. Broca's area is associated with actually people who have stroke victims. It actually is part of sort of being verbal and processing words. And for me, it's part of what we would call, brain reduced to size of pea syndrome, as I stand here. But there's no PowerPoint. It's going to be more of a standout routine, I think, if that's okay with you guys. Or maybe not a standout routine. And I'm going to share some clinical experience. I want to stimulate thought and heighten awareness. I have, my clinical work is with people who were adopted, 20 plus years ago. So certainly talking to people who were adopted sort of nowadays 50, up to 50 years ago. Adoption is slightly different now, but the point that I'm going to make is there is no adoption without trauma. And I'm certainly not going to be talking politically about whether it should happen or anything like that. There isn't really time, and I'm not completely sure, to be honest. But what I do believe is that there is no adoption without trauma. And some people, we've had people come in who adopted 50 years ago who actually didn't know they were adopted through their childhood. And I can think of one case of somebody who was getting married and didn't have a birth certificate and went to Somerset House to get their birth certificate to discover that if you were adopted, back then you had a different you were a different class of citizen, you had a different birth certificate. And so at that point, discovers that she's adopted. Well, I wonder whose needs were being met. There's a Chinese proverb. It says, the beginning of wisdom is to call something by its proper name. I think this is really important around adoption, because I think the word adoption, it has meaning, it's good, but I don't think it really talks about what goes on. The real wound is not adoption, it's relinquishment. And in a sense, adoption is a denial. It's a sort of happy ever after hope that, in which children are fortunate and in which they're chosen. Now, if you think about other conditions, if you suffered from bipolar, you wouldn't call them stabilizers, would you? If you suffered from drug addiction, we definitely wouldn't call them cleaners. So there's something about being relinquished and calling it adoption, which describes something but misses something. And I think it's a really important point, because it's part of the feeling that a lot of adopted clients have as children, that somehow what happened before didn't really matter. The old lie, you can't remember you were a baby. So what I'm going to propose to you, it's funny because when I chose a title for this talk, what I really wanted to call it was Developmental Trauma Disorder. But as you probably know, that doesn't actually exist, allegedly, didn't make it into the DSM-5, despite people like Van der Kolk trying really hard to get it there. I'm not quite sure why it didn't. I certainly talk about it. Because I think that's what we're talking about. I think we're talking about a group of people who suffer from a complicated developmental trauma, which can be clinically seen as a post-traumatic stress disorder. And I will talk a bit about that. When it comes to adoption, this is the adoption 101 bit. We talk about an adoption triad. There is the adopted child, the relinquished child, there is the birth parent, and the adoptive parents. I don't see that many birth parents clinically, but I'm really always struck that the ones that do come to clinic, they tend to say things like, not a day goes by when I don't think about that child. I'd like to see more. I think it'd be interesting to study more. I think it's a really complicated area. I see quite a lot of adopted parents, usually of sort of adolescents, increasingly of transracial or transcultural, but really it's transracial adoptees, tearing their hair out, saying things like, but we've provided this lovely middle-class home, and we even sent them to boarding school. And just wondering sort of what on earth has happened. But this presentation is going to focus on the relinquished child and clinical considerations for the treatment of addictions and other mental health disorders, and particularly trauma. There isn't enough time to talk really about the others in the triad. There isn't really enough time to talk about the politics. I don't have a strong view about adoption or whether it can happen, but I think there's some interesting politics. I don't have time to talk about the adoption industry, and believe me, there is one. A lot of money changes hands. A lot of money changes hands. And we're hearing more and more about the abuses of the Catholic Church and the mother and baby units, which some of you may have, may hear about, where actually young mothers having children out of wedlock have sinned and need to be saved, where the baby is born and taken away straight away and looked after by people who have no experience actually of mothering. In fact, have forgone the opportunity of having children, meaning nuns. So adoption is a complicated grief for all. It's the grief of a child growing up, waiting to meet someone that they've spent 9 months waiting to meet. It's the adoption of the child growing up and then ending up being adopted into a family that doesn't genetically fit. It's also, it's the grief of a child who actually in many cases has an impossible job description, which is to be part of that family. It doesn't fit. I'm also not going to have time to talk about reunions, and I think they're really interesting. But one of the things you hear, there are two things that really strike me about reunion stories. One is there's a very high instance of sexual relations between a child and a biological parent, which really fascinates me. But the other thing that you hear is that I just sort of knew, I looked at them and we felt we sort of stood in the same way. There was a sense of, gosh, I genetically fit. It's always very complicated, all of this sort of stuff. But it's quite interesting, that sort of genetic fit that is clearly picked up at a very sort of unconscious level. This is about the grief of a parent who can't live with having a child, very often young mothers, very often poverty, very often a family or a patriarchal family system that has decided that actually this really isn't okay for us to have a child, at this age. What will people think? And I hear a lot of stories, as perhaps you do, of families that have relocated in the last 3 months of pregnancy, to other sort of continents in order to have a child that can then be adopted, given up for adoption. And I'm not sure how much say the young mothers really have in all of that. It's also about the grief of adoptive parents. There are some altruistic cases, but it is about the grief of adoptive parents. I mean, many people, when you get married, you sort of think that there's a good chance we could have children and we might have, we'll have a family and it'll all be all right. And there's all sorts of issues, of course, about sort of infertility, or sometimes the death of a child. We've had cases where people have been adopted into families where a child has died, and actually within a year another child has been taken on. I think that that's a bit of an impossible job description. I think it's a bit of an impossible job description to be a replacement child. A family who then, families who can't conceive, who've maybe had a child or can't conceive, adopt a child, and then do conceive. I think that brings up quite a few feelings. How wanted was I? How part of this? And the grief that goes with all of that for parents, who, if we're focusing on chosen and fortunate, actually that grief, what happens to that grief? Because you think as a couple, if he or she is infertile, there's also a whole lot of feelings there, aren't there? I thought we could do this. What does it mean? Do we still have a deal? Do you know? I feel a bit disappointed. I thought we could have our own child. The feelings of guilt and shame, of anger or resentment, all understandable, but all that need to be worked upon and need to be talked about. But I think it doesn't get talked about. It's part of the cover-up. It's part of the problem, I think, in focusing too much on this word adoption and happy children chosen and fortunate. So it's about an enormous grief. The transcultural or transracial adoptions are fascinating. Of course, invariably, they are from black to white. They're sort of one way. And I think there's all sorts of problems with the politics of difference and all sorts of problems with sort of things like that, with racism. But my hypothesis is that the relinquishment is an abandonment. It's an abandonment trauma that's experienced as life-threatening at the beginning of life. It's hard to imagine a bigger trauma than actually loss of mother at the beginning of the life. Actually, Anna Freud, daughter of Sigmund, said actually the horrors of war pale in significance to the loss of mother. That's her quote. Pale in significance to the loss of mother. It's a pre-verbal, and which is going to be an important point I hope to make, psychological wound that is remembered but not recalled. And I think this is, and I'm going to talk a little bit about memory, because this is really important. It's very easy to think babies don't remember. You don't remember what's happened, but actually that makes it very, very complicated. Actually, we do have memory. What babies don't have is recall, because memory is implicit. It's in limbic brain, as opposed to actually in frontal cortex. It's still waiting to come online. So here's the neuroscience. Trauma and PTSD have been around for a long time. The large bulk of it has come up with it studying the Vietnam veterans. As you probably know, there was a lot of money for them, these guys coming back from war, the first time people had returned and weren't heroes. Big mental health problems. But actually, it's been around. Pierre Janet, who was at the end of the 19th century, talked about trauma as being the disease of presentation, which is quite, I was going to attempt to say that in French, but anyway, I'm not very good at that. But it's a disease of presentation, which is a really important point, because if you have trauma, you tend to have hypervigilance. And if you're in hypervigilance, it's very hard to be present. The two are mutually exclusive. And if you can't be present, you can't be spontaneous. So, I mean, I think that's quite interesting. We had a bit of, study of trauma, World War I, shell shock, and all of that. But it was mostly the sort of veterans. And then we start to think about what we call a trauma continuum, which is single event trauma on one end of the scale. You've been involved in some terrible accident or tragedy or an assault, to actually what we call sort of complex trauma, which is actually over a period of time, childhood sexual abuse, but I think also having been relinquished and trying to find your place in the world. What we also know about trauma is that actually what makes the difference between something being very stressful and something being very traumatic is attachment. Children actually are enormously resilient. But if you don't, so actually a stressful situation plus attachment remains a very stressful situation. A stressful situation without attachment tends to be a trauma. And I think that's, it's really quite an important point. It's the storm analogy, isn't it? That that in the storm, the trees that blow down, they blow down not because of just the strength of the wind, but actually the ones that blow down are the ones where the roots aren't strong enough. There isn't actually, of course, if we talked in attachment theory, there isn't a secure base, literally. So stress minus attachment tends to be trauma. We know it a lot from studying the children in the Palestinian refugee camps when their houses were being bulldozed, and everybody thought, gosh, this is a bit heavy. You don't know if your house is going to be bulldozed. You might be in it. You might not. You might come back, it's not there. And the psychologists all moved in, and when they do the bank of psychometrics, they discovered that actually children aren't that traumatized, and they're not, because there's people around. There are parents and tribe and family saying, this shouldn't be happening. This is outrageous. We're in it together. So think, if you're given up at the beginning of life by the one person that you really need, where is the secure base? What happens? Now, the human brain, unlike the computer, starts working before it's built. Okay? We have 100 billion neurons at birth. They can make 10,000 connections each. That's trillions of connections. And it actually, sort of neural development is dependent on social interaction. So as Van der Kolk said, and I love this phrase, and if it wasn't so well known, I'd try and pretend it was mine, experience is the architect of the brain. Alan Shaw, the American neuroscientist, says, neurons that fire together wire together. Experience is the architect of the brain. Neural development, depends on social interaction and experience. It's a really important point, and I'll come back to it later. We then had people like MacLean in the 1960s who introduced the idea of the triune brain, the idea that, wait a minute, we have not got just one brain, we have three. In fact, in each of those three areas, we have several other brains. But very typically, we have a rational brain, a cortex, we have a limbic brain, the emotional brain, and we have a reptilian brain. The cortex is responsible for level thinking, judgment, planning, conceptualizing. The limbic brain is involved with emotion and memory, and it's the limbic brain that's online from the beginning. It's the limbic, and the cortex, because it isn't online at the beginning, is why we don't have recall, you know, why we only start to remember things about our lives from about the age of sort of 3 or 4, depending. But there is memory, and I'll come back to that. And it's the limbic brain that's involved in mother-infant bonding. It was my limbic brain that soothed me when I was looking at my colleagues on the screen earlier on. It's my limbic brain that soothes me when I look around and I see a few people here that I know, and I think, yes, it's probably not an intervention. I think they're here to listen to me. Very, very important. So it's really part of mother-infant bonding. I'm going to look at the time, because you may also know that under stress, the part of the brain that mediates time switches off. So it's very possible for me to think I've only just started talking, and in fact, I've been talking for several hours. And when I'm under stress and you're not, you're going to be looking at your watch because you know how much time has passed. And actually also, because I really don't want to miss things, the other danger is that you get to the end of all of this and you miss the bit that says, so what are we going to do about it? It'll be like one of those self-help books. You get right to the end and everyone's explained your problems perfectly well, and actually you don't know what you're going to do. So I'm really trying to save you from that. Okay, and developmental trauma, there are 3 responses to trauma in general. One is, or a stressful situation. One is social engagement, a sort of like, let's get into the muddle, let's have a chat about this, I'm not happy about that. Tends to not be traumatic if you can do that. The other is mobilization, which is fight and flight that you hear about. Right, I'm going to run from here. And stress hormones, sometimes stress hormones get a bad name. Stress hormones are really good. They're really good. The problem is when you've got stress hormones, you can't do anything with them. You know, if you've had a shot, if your adrenal glands are doing what they should do, because your limbic brain has sent a message to reptilian brain that we need to mobilize, if you can fight or flight, that's pretty cool. You get to use up your hormones. It's a bit of a problem if you have an early psychological wound, because babies can't flight and fight. So they tend to be left with fawn. Actually, Pierre Janet, I'm a bit of a fan because I think it's so cool that people were talking about this. Pierre Janet he influenced Freud and Jung and William James. I mean, he's a very interesting guy, and you know, probably a name some of you haven't even heard of, but you know, well, Freud and Jung and William James. He also introduced the term, it was him who came up with dissociation. That's from him. And was starting to talk about things like transference, actually. He didn't use that word, but it comes from him. I don't quite know where I've gone with that, actually. I'm really sorry. Because I do get a bit excited. That is the other problem. Let's do attachment theory. Anyway, you can't really avoid learning about attachment theory, can you really, if you go to if you study psychotherapy and counselling. And it's one of those things, it's actually rather obvious now, and it's shocking to think that in the 1950s, you know, actually, we didn't really get our head around it. And those of you that have studied attachment theory may have seen, and they're on YouTube, the black and white pictures of children being left in hospitals, infants left in hospitals. They're really distressing. I wouldn't do it, if you know, unless you really have to. Seeing these little children who've been left and that are crying. But it did have an enormous impact, actually, on parents staying with children in hospitals. Although, I hope there's no one who's trained at the TAVI here, but if you go to the TAVI, on the steps, in the staircase in the TAVI, these black and white pictures of the great names, you know, Bowlby, Bion, marvellous people, actually, Winnicott, you know. But many of those people, very concerned about attachment theory, didn't stop them sending their kids to boarding school very early on. But they'll be tutting at the TAVI if they ever watch the recording. I quite like that expression, tutting at the TAVI. So where are we? Yeah, so Bowlby, and of course, fascinating, isn't it, attachment theory. So Bowlby had to go to America to have it taken seriously, bring it back here. But actually, a lot of the work was done by, you know, by the women. Mary Ainsworth, you know, later, Mary Main, the American psychologist in the 90s, did an awful lot of the work. But basically, the idea of attachment theory is there's a biological, inbuilt sort of system that motivates infants to seek proximity to caregivers. And it's all about survival. It's so that you can be protected from harm, from starvation, from attack and separation. And it's why a lot of mammals will make a lot of noise when mother disappears. Puppies, kittens, ducklings, humans, they cry. You cry out. It's about seeking attachment. I'm here. You know, I live down in the country, you see all these lambs. I'm really struck by how a lamb can call and the right ewe comes along. Because it seems a bit of a lottery to me when you're in the field. But they can. But they can. They can come along. And interestingly, when you talk to adoptees, they tend to cluster at each end of the spectrum. So you'll meet some who will say, I was told I just cried and cried. I just cried and cried. And then you'll meet others, and it often gets me thinking about things like the Romanian orphans, who just said, actually, apparently I was just a really silent baby. They went into freeze and dissociation, but actually didn't make any noise. And a lot of the people we're seeing are clustering at either end. You're either crying an awful lot, or actually you've gone into complete silence. Mary Main was the person who really came up with the ideas about insecure attachment and all the different classifications, which you probably know, and was very clear that mother-infant bonding it has an enormous sort of influence on psychopathology later in life. In fact, she said that the well-being of the child is 75% dependent on the mental well-being of the mother. The mother's ability to, what she said, the mother's ability to tell an emotionally coherent story. That means a story of her life, not a story. And we sort of know this. We know human beings need to be sort of known and understood to belong to a group. That's how we stay safe. That's how we're top of the food chain. We weren't always, but we've done it because we're group animals. And attachment theory helps us sort of stay together and regulates us. In times like this, for example. There's also, though, you get what Freud talked about. Freud talked about His Majesty the baby, and there's the notion too, I think, of bad baby syndrome. The idea that the child. So what Freud was really saying was that the human infant is enormously self-centered, and if something is wrong in the world, the human infant is unable to think there's something up with mum and dad. They tend to think it must be about me. You see it with early cases of sexual abuse, actually. The amount of people, and you'll know this, you can see in the consulting room, who have been clearly sexually abused, who feel in some way they are responsible for the abuse. Again, it tends to cluster with gender. The females tend to think somehow I brought it on. The males tend to feel ashamed because somehow they didn't fight it off. But somewhere that feeling of this is something to do with me. So again, where attachment starts to go wrong, a feeling that, the infant is unable to think, Dad hit Mum. I think that's not right. Dad went off. Mum did this. There's something wrong with me, which of course is the beginning of shame. It's the beginning of anxiety, these great feelings that fuel addictions. So the child basically grows up like a plant around a stone, just sort of adapting. And in many ways, adoption is an adaptation. And I think that feels like an important point. I'm going to talk about memory for a moment. I hope to bring all of this sort of stuff together. But Tony DeCasper at the University of North Carolina, great guy, lots of prenatal research. And this is really, really important stuff, because what he was able to show is that the newborn infant, within 24 hours of being born, can detect mother's breast milk on a pad of 10 different breast milks. Okay? That's memory. That's memory. Now, people often say, how do you know? Because they're certainly not filling out questionnaires saying, I like that one best. But we know it because actually they're measured by head turning, sucking and respiration responses. Basically a dummy with a pressure monitor on the end. Now he also it showed us that in the last 6 weeks of pregnancy, babies actually remember sounds of voices and actually sort of, I don't know whether it's quite tones, I think it's probably cadence. So what he had people doing was that pregnant mothers, in the last 6 months of pregnancy, reading The Cat in the Hat out loud to the baby. And these babies showed a preference for mother's voice over other voices, sucking, head turning, respiration responses. Okay? They also showed a preference for the cat in the hat. I think that's interesting. So that old lie that you can't remember, it doesn't affect you, is really challenged, because this stuff is stored limbically. Now, actually, Tony de Casper died. He died a couple of years ago. I bet none of you have even heard of him, have you? No. I rather hope at his funeral they read The Cat in the Hat. Maybe he might hear it. Maybe it'll soothe him in the afterlife. Who knows? But really, very, very important experiments, about prenatal experience. And we have to hold on to this, because what it is telling us, so if you think about being prepared to listen to mum's voice or to hear some of the sounds and that changing, actually your world feels pretty unsafe when that suddenly goes. And what I'm also going to suggest to you is that whilst we might talk about one adoption, we are actually often talking about many relinquishments, because it's quite rare that baby is born and handed over. It's much more likely, and that's before we start talking about incubators and premature babies. And we know that there's lots of research actually on incubated babies, on premi babies, and very high incidence of depression. Perhaps not too surprisingly, but there's a lot of research on that. But so you're born, you're given up by mother. You might be taken off, maybe by the nuns. You might be taken off somewhere, given, left. I've lived a lot of people who were sort of left outside of orphanages. In India or South America, Nepal, a lot of these stories. You're taken in, you're one of many. Somebody tries to find a home for you. So you think you've got relinquishment from mum, everything changes. God, bloody hell, what's happening if the child could talk? There I am. Okay, we're getting used to this. It's slightly different smells and sounds and stuff, but these people, maybe this is sort of all right. Not getting an awful lot of holding. There's rather a lot of us babies here, I should think. It's that sort of thing. And then you're off again. If you're a transracial adoptee, that's quite a problem too. Because actually, it's the things that really, so think about smell and what Tony de Casper told us about smell. The Indian subcontinent smells different from, downtown Kensington. It just does. These things are different. The sounds are different. The cadence is different. It smells different. These are big disruptions. These are big disruptions. And this is also before we start talking about, we've had clients who actually have been adopted and then given back. You sort of think like, I don't know, like doing a return to Amazon or something, isn't it? It doesn't work. But you think what that does. You think what that does. And there are lots of different adoptions that happen. So people that are maybe born, somebody's born into a family where, or maybe adopted into a family where there's already a child, or maybe later on discovers, actually on reunion, that they were given up by a family that kept all the other children. There's so many different, it's a very, very colourful thing. And the story, the relinquishment stories are really, really important, because those are the stories that affect limbic brain. Those are the things that are remembered limbically, are held in implicit memory systems, and actually start to make sense of things that happen later in life. So good old Tony de Casper and the cat in the hat, I think. So what do we see in adoptees and indeed, I think actually the important thing is that other people who suffer from early developmental wounds. We see issues with concentration and focus, the hypervigilance, living on red alert, very hard to be present. We see difficulties in relationships, and difficulties being oneself, because the first time I was myself, it was pretty disruptive. Actually it was a disaster. That's the feeling. Limbically, being myself is probably not a good thing. We see a loss of self. We see an awful lot of codependence, people trying to be something else for others in order to fit in. What do you have to do to fit in round here? Which is sort of what codependence in many ways is about. We see sleep dysregulation. We see a lot of gastrointestinal problems. Probably not a surprise, because the world of the baby is pretty much poo and puke, isn't it? You know, so a lot of gastrointestinal problems, a lot of skin rashes. I don't know how well that's been researched. Quite a lot of high incidence of things like psoriasis. Certainly see a lot of shallow breathing. And in fact, part of trying to help people with these sort of traumas often involves breathing. That's actually why the horses are very good. Because if you can calm yourself around a horse, you can connect to the horse, because they read the body language. People with early developmental trauma breathe in a really shallow way. And the problem with that is you miss out on the out breath. So the in breath is about the sympathetic nervous system. The in breath is right, we're ready for something. And that's if you had developmental trauma, that's sort of where you always are. The out breath calms the parasympathetic nervous system. Breathing deeply and breathing out slowly is really important. That's why, although I'm sure they didn't know it at the time, saying om for a long note is very calming. It's why actually whistling might sort of really piss off lots of people around you, but actually it's quite calming. It's why in church a lot of hymns begin with these very long notes. I'm not going to try and do it, but you know, oh God, you know, the sort of thing, I mean, because that's calming. It's very calming, but of course you don't have that because shallow breathing and often held breath. In fact, around the horses, one of the things you often have to do with people is to say, breathe, and they breathe, and the horse completely changes. Because if you're like that, you know, horses are preyed upon, so they're forever, like they want to know who's going to have them for dinner. That's what, you know, that's why they're, you know, such experts. We see a lot of self-soothing. We see early compulsive masturbation, a lot of nail biting and thumb sucking with early developmental trauma, overuse of sugar, quite a few OCD behaviors, hair pulling, things like that. The other thing that's quite interesting is certainly in private practice when you're working with adoptees, you might give them a bank of psychometric questionnaires. You might measure depression and anxiety. What you do find is that people who've had depression and anxiety for a long time often don't look as depressed or anxious as they are. So if you think about a standard depression question like the BDI, Beck's Depression Inventory, if you score over 23, you probably want to have a chat with your GP about some antidepressants. Not saying you should take them, but it's the sort of thing that somebody would consider. We're talking about groups of people that might be scoring up in the high 20s, but when you look at them, they're quite put together, because basically they've just learned to live with. They've normalized these sort of things. They look really quite put together. People with an incidental depression, you can see depression, can't you? I mean, it's a shape. But, you know, this has gone on for a long time. It's a very different presentation. It's really worth doing because it's quite easy to think these people are all right. And I get quite a few people, actually, in clinic who feel the need to say to me, Paul, you do know how fucked up I am, don't you? Do you know? Because I also like to be quite sort of positive about what people are doing. But this is terrible because people realize they have become experts in sort of hiding, you know, hiding how they are. We see a lot of catastrophic thinking. And of course, I mean, why wouldn't you? If you've had a catastrophe, you know, if the first person in your life leaves you, who says the next person isn't going to do it? So you get an awful lot of catastrophic thinking. And people sort of, they get an envelope and they don't recognize the writing and it's like, this is something awful. Do you know? An awful lot of, you know, real sensitivity to sort of criticism and things like that. We also start to see, we see a lot of addiction to adrenaline, and I think that's a really interesting point, because I think that actually sometimes I wonder whether addiction actually really is an attempt to regulate by restoring sort of cortisol and adrenaline. We see there's mother-infant bonding is associated with low serotonin as well, by the way, and serotonin actually has an enormous impact on the bit of the brain that you probably all have heard about, which is the amygdala, the smoke detector in the limbic brain, the one that sort of goes off and tells you that there's danger. That if you have low serotonin as a result of failed mother-infant bonding, your smoke detector is going to go off, it's going to go off when the toast is in rather than when the house is on fire, yeah, basically. A lot of addiction to adrenaline, people with, dangerous occupations, working in war zones, in different ways, in quite famous cases around that. A lot of dangerous sports, skiing off-piste, swimming with sharks. And of course, we see the chemical and process addictions, religiosity, meaning fundamentalism. I think it's probably our #1 mental health disorder. Workaholism, the addiction to busyness and adrenaline, of course. Eating disorders, either control by restricting of my world is so out of control, but I can restrict. Or the soothing that happens from overeating. And the soothing is, and of course, what happens if we're eating and chewing? What the limbic brain picks up when we're eating and chewing is that things must be okay. We can't be under attack because we're having a meal. And that sends a message to the reptilian brain that says, it's all right, you can put your weapons down, guys. We can just hang out. So actually, seriously, when we talk about comfort eating, that is actually what we're doing. It's one of the things that we have to really train people with those sort of eating disorders to think about it. It makes a sense what you're doing. But actually you're trying to regulate something that could possibly be regulated in another way. So we're also seeing people with an awful lot of ambivalence, a feeling that ambivalence is what is being pulled strongly in two directions. So we're seeing groups of people who, in terms of frontal cortex, really want to do something. They've got a vision and a goal. And actually, a lot of adoptees are very, very bright because cortisol is a growth hormone. So if you get a big shot of it at the beginning, you're going to get a bigger brain, you're going to get more opportunities. So it's associated with high intelligence. So you've got people who really have got a lot of capabilities, but you've got a limbic brain that says, oh, I'm not really that valuable, and the world is pretty dangerous anyway, and who knows what's around the corner. So you get pulled in two directions, which means that you do what we see a lot of our clients say they do, sabotage. But it's because we've got two parts of the brain pulling strongly in two directions. Ambivalence. It's Latin. Ambivalence. So all of this, of course, is like the sort of beginnings. A lot of this stuff becomes the beginnings of codependency. There are four. Okay. I really do need to make sure we talk about what we can do, don't I? Because we're going to be in a real state. There are four problems for the relinquished child. Very, very important. I want you to get this. I mean, some of you are taking notes. It's being recorded anyway. But the first one is there is a trauma. I hope that I pointed that out to you. There is a trauma. Actually, there's memory. We know what's safe. We know what isn't. And actually it goes. And there are several traumas in the whole relinquishment. There might be a happy adoption in terms of a nice family, but there is a trauma, and if it's not talked about, that's a real problem. It's a real problem, and that's where you start getting into, it's like the whole adult child movement that's going on today, which is brilliant, really, which is really a trauma therapy. Because, if stuff isn't talked about, then it doesn't get processed. You can only change what you acknowledge. And for the child, you can only acknowledge what is acknowledged for you. So there is a trauma, #1, okay? Anna Freud says, horrors of war pale in comparison. #2, the trauma can't be recalled, but it's remembered, which means that actually people with these early wounds have real difficulty making sense of themselves. If you have a car crash, if you're assaulted, you sort of can remember what happened. It makes a bit of a sense. Third point, really important, is that an early developmental wound, there is no what we call pre-trauma personality. So if you have a car crash or you're assaulted around the corner here, and you might think, oh, bloody hell, I'm not going near Ken High Street again, you do at least know that once upon a time you could go near Ken High Street. If you have a trauma at the beginning of your life, what you don't have is an experience of being okay at any point. So you have the feeling that this is me. Everything I feel about myself is me. Everything I feel about myself is me and that person that isn't good enough and yet is also too much. Very, very difficult. You then have the fourth problem that these people have, which is adaptation requires fitting in with another tribe. And often a tribe that hasn't really talked about why you're there and what it means and what their grief was. And the impossible job description. So let's come to treatment and recovery. The goal, of course, of treatment is to decrease the disorganizing impact of arousal. It's about affect regulation. It's about trying to do something about dysregulation that happens so easily for people who've had trauma. Dysregulation being the message that goes in a nanosecond from limbic brain to reptilian brain that says we're under attack, which bypasses a nanosecond before the frontal cortex has a chance to really think about it. That's why, actually, there isn't a lot of evidence with trauma victims that doing things like making gratitude lists make any difference. Because actually, the part of the brain that actually starts to regulate us, isn't really interested in what's on the gratitude list. You know, you're going to be hijacked whatever happens. Well, we know when we're treating addictions, we know, don't we, that there are 4 scales in a way. If people have a drug or alcohol addiction, the chemical addictions have to be treated first. You then want to think about the process addictions. You then want to think about the codependency below all of that. You then want to think about the trauma. So, you know, there are certain things, sometimes a bit of an order, but it's quite difficult to, you know, treat this stuff in somebody who's out of control with their drug and alcohol use. And actually, to some extent, eating disorders, because food is, of course, such a sort of chemical. And certainly as clinicians, we need to be, I think, what Alice Miller called an enlightened witness. I think we have a responsibility, and this is why I like to do this stuff, to say, hey guys, this is the thing. You know, you belong to a group that's overrepresented in addiction. You know, we think there's a reason for that. We may not understand it properly, but we think there's a reason. You sort of need to know. You know, that you have clusters of symptoms. An enlightened witness to be able to sort of understand what's happening. We need to be a teacher in order to make things clear. The real C word, I think, in addictions counselling is clarity. Giving people real clarity about what we're doing, why we're doing it, what's going to happen. We need to be a therapist. We need to understand transference and countertransference. There's an awful lot of longing for the therapist. There's also quite a bit of hating the therapist. But all is worth trying to understand. We need to be an interpreter. I can think of a client we've had who said to me, she was given up at 2 weeks, and you try and hold the story in mind when you listen to the things that they bring along. And I'm really trying to do something about my eating, and I start this new regime of eating, but I seem to give up around sort of 10, 12 days. I think that's quite interesting, don't you? That somebody might give up on themselves, you know, at a point in which they were given up. I don't know, maybe I've been hanging around with the analysts for too long, but it's like those sort of things I think are really fascinating. We need to be a coach. There's a lot of goal and vision setting. But the thing is that talking and self-knowledge often isn't enough. And hold that in mind. It's because it's very frontal cortex. And also remember Broca's area, that when you start talking about trauma, this is what the guys at Harvard Med School discovered, put these people in an MRI scan, start them thinking about their trauma, and Broca's area sort of actually doesn't light up, it actually goes offline, which is why then you can't remember things. It's why a lot of people with early wounds like to record sessions or make notes. I used to be terribly worried about that in case it ended up in court or something, because I'm quite capable of saying something ridiculous. And, but actually, it just makes a lot of sense. Because they come out and somebody says, how was your session? And I don't remember. I don't remember. It's being processed somewhere, but it's not recalled. I don't recall should be what they say. So there are different things. We need to do either top-down therapies or bottom-up therapies. Top-down means starting thinking about cortex and working down to reptilian. And bottom-up means maybe thinking more about the sort of the body and things that are happening more sort of in a reptilian way. I think there's one journey. I think there are many roads. I think if you come across someone who tells you there's only one way to do it, that's probably not the person to be referred to. The person to be referred to is probably the one who says, I'm not quite sure, but we're trying lots of different things. Because actually there's so much we don't know. Like many mental health issues, very good at describing, not so great at treating. And I think as psychotherapists, we can get a bit sort of precious and a bit worried, I think. You know, there's over 50 different schools of psychotherapy in the UK. I'm sure everyone's terribly worried that the other 49 are a bit better. So we can get quite protective and sort of not share the information. But the top-down approach is based on the idea that you can only change what you acknowledge. It's a really important thing. You can only change what you acknowledge, the Chinese proverb, okay? The beginning of wisdom, call something by its proper name. And the idea that actually victims don't recover. Unless you acknowledge something, you're going to stay a victim. I think it's one of the reasons why 12-step programs can be quite effective, because there's a big emphasis on admission and acknowledgement. Aside from the fact that they are also anxiety and stress management programs, they seem to be, like, people like to call them spiritual, but really it's about limbic resonance and anxiety and stress management. It's about hanging out with people who sort of get you. It's about attachment. I mean, there's an awful lot more to it. But really, it's just helping people understand also that recovery is measured by the uncomfortable actions that you take. That you do have to get some coaching. You're going to have to, if you want to change, you're going to have to try and push yourself out of a comfort zone. You're going to need help for that. Again, why self-help groups, coaches, buddies are really important. Recovery is measured by the uncomfortable actions that you take. And people need information that actually, you know, avoidance is pretty exhausting. For example, you know, it actually takes more energy to not do something than it does to do it. I had this yesterday morning. I took the morning off to write my presentation. I got exhausted and I did nothing at all because I was just desperately trying to do everything else. As soon as I got going, I was in it. I was in it. It takes more energy to put something off than it does to do it. The other important point is to help people realize that getting well, the problem with getting well is that you get to discover how unwell you've been, and there is a bit of depression with that. You know, so actually sometimes, and of course also the absence of drama can feel like there's something wrong. If you've been adrenalized, you know, if you've had adrenaline and cortisol for a long time, the absence of drama does feel a bit flat. And if we're onto something with the idea that addiction actually might be something to do with an addiction to adrenaline and cortisol, you know, because we need to somehow do things consistently that leave us feeling ashamed and anxious, then when you stop doing that, here, frontal cortex says, that's a good idea. Here, limbic brain says, feels a bit fucking weird. Sorry about my clinical language, but we'll sort of get there. So a lot of information. People also need info about relationships. You know, the whole idea that, because the problem is if you can't be yourself, it's very hard to have a relationship. Esther Perel says, is this lovely phrase, isn't it? In order to be one, you need to be two. In order to be one as a couple, you need to be two. But actually, we're talking about people for whom actually abandonment, you know, the amygdala goes off very, very early on. So when she says, I don't think I want to go out tonight, I'm just going to stay at home, he goes, she doesn't love me anymore, she's got someone else, I'm going to be left. And vice versa. Because the amygdala has reacted to the toaster, not the house burning down. So people need a lot of understanding, and the other one, understanding in relationships. Actually, we tend to partner up with people who are pretty much the same, you know, as intimate and capable as we are. So if you're in a relationship with someone who makes out they're a bit more sort of, have done more personal growth and more developed, I'd walk in the other direction. Because Snow White never marries the big bad wolf. It doesn't happen like that. And Prince Charming doesn't marry the Wicked Witch. It just doesn't happen like that. We then have the bottom up. I'm talking so quickly, and I'm sorry, because I don't want to miss it. And I'm excited. I think this is really, are you with me? I think this is such important stuff, don't you? The bottom-up therapies are the one that are going to be far more thinking about reptilian brain. So we're talking about well-being habits, exercise, nutrition, relaxation, prayer, meditation rituals, body awareness, actually going to the gym, toning, Pilates, really, really important. If you're doing Pilates, you know, it's quite hard to feel depressed and anxious if you can stand up straight. You know, the more awareness you have of your body, I'm not talking about you don't have to pump iron forever or, you know, enter competitions, but having a body awareness is really, really important. Because actually, a lot of the time, we're talking about people who somehow are safest under the radar. And under the radar is a shape, and that shape is a feeling. Some of the somatic therapies, so somatic experiencing, is very much sort of in flavor, basically focuses on clients' body sensations, helping them learn to sort of navigate them when they're triggered. Very, very good alongside other therapies. You know, anything sort of somatic, I think, is important. EMDR, another big flavor, eye movement, desensitization and reprocessing. there isn't, I have to tell you, there's not a lot of clinical research. In fact, there isn't really any clinical research into developmental trauma, early wounds with EMDR. It is a treatment of choice. It's very effective for single instant trauma and adult trauma. But I think it's always worth doing. I think it doesn't do any harm. Worst scenario is it calms the hypothalamus, actually. So you can feel quite sort of calm afterwards. But EMDR focuses, as you know, on what they call negative cognitions. What actually, years before, psychologists like Bolas called unthought knowns. Things in our brain that we know, but we don't know we know. They're unthought knowns. I'm not worthy. The world isn't a safe place. I can't possibly be myself. Visible is vulnerable. All the things that they're not in our conscious, but they're there in limbic brain. And they drive. They're the ones that send the signal nanoseconds before the frontal cortex that actually there's danger. It's those cognitions that dysregulate us. It's the same thing. I often say this one. It's like when the man-eating tiger enters the room, it's the limbic brain that says, let's get out of here, before the frontal cortex can say, what nice stripes. You know, there's a reason. It's about survival. And it actually, of course, in many ways defies logic and becomes very much about, it means it's very hard to take the long view. So if that's how you're geared up with your amygdala, you have low serotonin associated with your amygdala going off early, then actually it becomes quite hard to see things through, that if I do this, then that will happen down the line. Which is why I think a lot of the 12-step programs have talked about insanity, you know, and all of that stuff about repeating mistakes and being unable to see things to their full conclusion. Because you're probably hijacked by an limbic brain that's just ready, you know, to take an action now, because it doesn't matter what happens later if you're in danger. I'm a big fan of the horses, as you know. They're experts in reading body language. They pick up on all the somatic signs, breathing, muscle tension, heart rate, and they're very good at teaching boundaries. If you've got half a ton of animal in front of you, you're going to learn how to keep a boundary with it. They don't play games, and they're very good at teaching self-soothing, because as you regulate yourself, it helps you learn to do this deep abdominal breathing, which is so absent with developmental trauma disorder. Psychodramas, very, very useful stuff. Emotional freedom technique, known as tapping. I've never actually done it, but I don't know why I have a problem with it, because there is actually quite a lot of good clinical sort of data. I just think it's a bit odd. But actually, that's just me. There's good clinical evidence for EFT. Yeah, havening, another one, quite a somatic sort of therapy you may know about. Mindfulness practices, of course, but mindfulness best done when it focuses on breathing. Because again, if we can organize our breath, and we've got the out-breath, we can send a message from the bottom up. The out-breath is saying to limbic brain, things are okay. We're not, you know, we're not on red alert anymore. We're not armed and ready for the, you know, for the instruction to go into battle. And limbic brain can think, okay, let's chill. And actually, the cortex can then think, yeah, let's get on with what we were doing. Let's get on with what we were doing that somehow we were sort of taken away from. So, I don't know if I've convinced you, but I think we're talking about a very powerful developmental trauma. You were talking about an abandonment that is experiences life-threatening, so that when and the brain, which is a reflective organ, when it comes across, and that's why we're top of the food chain, when it comes across something similar, like he doesn't want to be with me, she doesn't, my boss is giving me a funny look, smoke detector goes off, amygdala goes off, we think we're about to lose our jobs, lose our lives, be annihilated, it's going to be the end of the world. We have become dysregulated, hijacked. And the aim of treatment really needs to be sort of affect regulation. Does it make sense? Yeah? I never got time to do this, because I'm supposed to stop 5 minutes ago. I'm going very quickly, because actually one of my clients brought in, she's 60, and she brought a letter in that she'd found. Her parents had died, and she brought a letter in from that a Harley Street doctor had written about her when she was aged 8, and she was having some stomach problems, some gastrointestinal problems. Her father And her father was an alcoholic. She may well at that time have been sent off to boarding school, but she was taken up to Harley Street. So this is 1968. It says, and this is back to from the specialist to the GP. So, dear Dr. So-and-so, thank you for your letter about client's name. It was delightful to hear from you again. Fair enough. Physically, client is 100% healthy and possesses one of the most lovely figures that I've seen in a young girl for a long time. She's really beautiful. Well, you wouldn't say that, would you, nowadays? Intellectually, client is at least 3 years in advance of her age, and I'm sure she finds it irksome and frustrating to conform to the behaviour pattern expected of her age. I'm glad to know that she's going off to boarding school in a year because the routine and discipline of boarding school will be much to her liking and will. Massive history of bedwetting, by the way. Big history of bedwetting with all of this. Not a very cool thing to do if you're at boarding school, as you might know. You know, difference is really attacked. Like so many very active, tireless children, she is inclined at times to be a bit liverish, and this aspect would be helped by cutting down on intake of fat and cream and seeing that at meal times she gets a good intake of sugar. Do you want to guess the process addiction? Yes, you're right, of course. Comfort eating, compulsive overeater. Yeah. I think I'll sort of leave the letter there. Anyway, we moved on. We've moved on from all of that, and this is the thing, and people didn't know, but we do, and we have a responsibility to say, this is a thing. This is a thing. You know, if experience is the architect of the brain, you've been wired up differently. And God, that was my whistle-stop tour of adoption. There's so much more to say. Thank you very much.